Marshall Reed wore the badge like armor, Felix Dorn used it like a weapon, and Lena Caro died trying to expose them. In the heart of Westbridge, a secret police gang turned protectors into pryers. Until one rookie cop, Neil Huxley, bled for the truth, and Valerie Briggs uncovered a conspiracy that shook the entire justice system. Detective Marshall Reed was once the golden boy of the Westbridge Police Department. With a sharp jawline, a steady hand, and a file full of glowing performance reviews, he was the face the department showcased to the press. He received medals for bravery, was featured in community outreach programs, and was regularly quoted in crime reports as a key figure in major busts. But what no one outside the department knew was that Marshall Reed was more than just a detective. He was the entry point into one of the most secretive criminal organizations hidden in plain sight, an organization built not in back alleys or abandoned warehouses, but inside the very walls of law enforcement itself. They called it the Blue Gang. The Blue Gang wasn't a group of low-level corrupt officers taking bribes or fudging reports. It was an organized criminal enterprise operating from within the precinct, and at its head was Commander Felix Dorn, a man known for his charisma, his tactical brilliance, and his complete lack of conscience. Felix had been building the gang for nearly a decade, recruiting officers who showed either vulnerability or ambition. He didn't just want followers. He wanted loyalty, silence, and obedience. New recruits to the Blue Gang didn't always realize what they were stepping into. It started small, overlooking a misplaced evidence file here, changing the time on a suspect's arrest record there. But each favor earned them something: extra cash, a better shift, protection from complaints. The deeper they went, the more they were rewarded, and the more they were trapped. Leaving the Blue Gang wasn't an option. Those who tried were either ruined professionally or disappeared entirely. Marshall Reed had joined during his second year on the force. He had shown promise, but also carried the weight of student Deb, a sick mother, and a desperation for advancement. Felix saw the cracks and stepped in. With a subtle offer of help and a warning about the political nature of police work, Felix introduced him to the system. Reed was promoted quickly, earned access to confidential databases, and became the Blue Gang's key to manipulating internal investigations. He scrubbed files, rerouted complaints, and made sure no paper trail led back to Felix. The gang's reach extended beyond the station. They controlled certain street gangs, taxed drug shipments that passed through the city, and even supplied tips to criminal organizations about upcoming raids. So long as a percentage came back to them, courtroom evidence disappeared, surveillance footage was deleted, and witnesses were silenced. Most people assumed this kind of corruption only happened in movies or third-world countries. But in Westbridge, it had become standard operating procedure. What made the Blue Gang so dangerous was how clean they appeared. Felix made sure the group stayed invisible. No tattoos, no secret signals, no flashy crimes. Everything was calculated, silent, and protected by the uniform. And the few in the department who suspected something didn't have the courage, or the evidence, to speak up. Whispers circulated in the locker rooms. Some officers believed something was off. A few even tried to raise concerns. But those officers were transferred to smaller districts, assigned endless deck duty, or discredited with fabricated misconduct reports. The Blue Gang protected itself like a living organism, with every part of the system reinforcing the lie. And so, Marshall Reed continued to climb. Each promotion tied not to justice but to silence. By the time he became the public license for the department, he was no longer just an officer. He was a shield, a smiling face for press conferences, carefully feeding stories of successful busts while the truth stayed buried behind redacted memos and corrupted files. To the public, Westbridge PD was a model of efficiency. Crime rates appeared to fall. Conviction rates seemed impressive, and press coverage was favorable. But none of it was real. It was a carefully crafted illusion, sustained by a gang that wore uniforms, carried legal firearms, and swore an oath they never intended to keep. The Blue Gang wasn't just part of the police. They were the police. And as long as their secrets stayed buried, they were untouchable. Or so they believed. Lena Caro wasn't a household name, but in investigative journalism circles, she was known as Relentless. With a degree in criminal justice and a history of uncovering small-town corruption, Lena had developed a sharp instinct for stories others missed. When she arrived in Westbridge, it was for a routine assignment, an article about the rising trust in local law enforcement. But as she dug deeper into department reports and court proceedings, small inconsistencies began to surface. They were subtle: mismatched arrest dates, only redacted files, missing evidence logs. Most journalists would have overlooked them. Leah didn't. She began to do a quiet profile of what she called the gaps. It started with an armed robbery case. The suspect was arrested but released before trial with no official explanation. The police claimed insufficient evidence, yet Lena discovered that surveillance footage had existed, footage that vanished before reaching court. She found similar patterns in at least 4 other cases, drug busts that led nowhere, violent offenders disappearing from custody, and unusually fast promotions for officers involved in those arrests. What caught her attention most was a name that kept appearing in these questionable reports: Commander Felix Dorn. He wasn't always the lead officer, but his signature approved every major decision. Lena tried to find more about him. Official biographies were polished and shallow. His early career records were unusually clean. Too clean. That's when she knew something wasn't right. Lena expanded her investigation. She submitted public records requests, attended city council meetings, and quietly interviewed former Westbridge officers who had left the force under suspicious circumstances. They were hesitant to speak, but a few hinted at something deeper, an inner circle within the department, untouchable and dangerous. One former officer mentioned the Blue Gang, then immediately stopped talking. He wouldn't say more, only that digging too deep would be a mistake. For weeks, Lena worked in secret, compiling her findings into what she hoped would be her biggest expose yet. She wasn't just dealing with corruption. She was chasing what appeared to be an organized criminal operation inside the police force. Her breakthrough came when an anonymous whistleblower mailed her a flash drive. Inside were internal documents, radio transcripts, and a single unredacted memo referencing a covert group operating under the name BlueNet, a term never used publicly. She knew she was onto something explosive, but she also knew she was being watched. Unmarked cars parked near her apartment at odd hours. Her internet connection became unreliable. Her calls sometimes cut off mid-sentence. Still, she pressed forward, working late into the night, encrypting files, and backing up every document she had. She scheduled a meeting with a regional news producer, hoping to take the story national. The night before the meeting, Lena never arrived home. Her car was found the next morning, half submerged in the River Tellon. The police report claimed she must have swerved off the road during heavy rain. Her body was recovered, her laptop missing, and her apartment broken into. Authorities called it a tragic accident, but for those who had followed her work, it felt more like a message. What the Blue Gang didn't know was that Lena had planned for this. 2 days before her death, she had mailed copies of her findings to a friend, someone outside the city, someone she trusted. That friend, unsure what to do but fearing a cover-up, submitted the files anonymously to a national crime watchdog group. Within a week, the files surfaced online. They were messy, unverified, and heavily redacted, but they were enough. Journalists, activists, and even some state investigators began asking questions. The name Blue Gang started to circulate not just in backrooms, but in public forums. The city of Westbridge tried to contain the leak. Officials dismissed the documents as forgeries. The police department issued a formal denial, stating that Lena Carroll was a valued citizen who had sadly passed away. But behind the scenes, panic spread. Whispers of internal investigations grew louder. Officers who once stood proud behind the badge began to look over their shoulders. Lena was gone, but her story had just begun to unravel the secret that Westbridge had buried for over a decade. Officer Neil Huxley had always dreamed of becoming a cop. Fresh out of the academy and assigned to the Westbridge 8th Precinct, he believed he was about to serve the community, make a difference, and follow the example set by officers he had admired growing up. But the reality he stepped into was nothing like what he had trained for. From the very beginning, things felt off. There was an unspoken hierarchy that didn't match official ranks. Certain officers walked with an air of untouchable authority. Files disappeared from his desk. Reports were rewritten without his knowledge. When he asked questions, he was told to mind his business. Neil had a strong moral compass, but he wasn't naive. He'd heard of corruption in other cities, but what unsettled him was how organized it seemed here. It wasn't just isolated misbehavior, it was systemic. During his first few months, Neil saw arrests being manipulated. Officers would falsify the locations of crime scenes or exaggerate charges to meet quotas. Worse, he saw clear signs of criminal collaboration. Known gang affiliates were being let off with barely a slap on the wrist, while harmless citizens were charged without reason. When Neil reported one such incident, where planted narcotics were found in a care that had clearly been clean, his supervisor, Sergeant Malone, revised the report before it was submitted. Neil pushed back. That was his first mistake. The next day, his locker was broken into, and his personal journal, where he had recorded observations and concerns, was gone. He received an unsigned note inside his patrol card. "Be careful what you write." And still, he didn't back down. Instead, Neil began documenting everything more carefully and discreetly. He took photos of case files, saved body footage, and recorded radio communications. He didn't know who to trust inside the department, so he went outside. A contact from his academy days connected him with Joseph Finnick, a retired officer who had been forced out of the Westbridge force years ago. Finnick had spent years trying to expose corruption but had been silenced through character attacks and legal threats. He warned Neil that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be safe. Neil didn't fully grasp how dangerous it was until the night of the 14th Precinct drug raid. He'd been assigned backup on what was meant to be a high-stakes operation in a suspected drug house, but something was off. When Neil arrived on the scene, he realized the location didn't match the warrant. There were no drugs, no suspects, just silence. Then came the gunshots. 3 bullets tore through the side of his vehicle. 2 hit him. 1 shattered his femur. Neil was rushed to the hospital and placed in intensive care. The department issued a statement saying he had been ambushed by gang members. But Neil knew better. The position of the shooters, the setup, it had been a trap. Someone had wanted him silenced. The incident made local news. The department paraded his bravery, calling him a hero. Behind closed doors, they assumed he'd stay quiet, intimidated, injured, and grateful to be alive. But Neil did the opposite. During recovery, he contacted Finnick again. Together, they organized the evidence Neil had been collecting. Medical reports, photo logs, surveillance footage, all cross-referenced and time-stamped. They encrypted the files and uploaded them to a secure cloud. With help from Finnick's old journalist contacts and an anonymous online account, they began leaking the information to multiple platforms. Slowly, the pieces started catching attention. Bloggers, podcasters, and a few national journalists picked up the scent. The phrase, "Blue Gang," started appearing in headlines, this time with documentation to support it. The public's faith in the Westbridge Police Department began to crack. Protests formed. Demands for accountability rose. Neil, now recovering with a prosthetic leg, was quietly placed on indefinite leave. But his voice was louder than ever. He didn't care about the badge anymore. He wanted truth. He wanted justice. And he wasn't alone anymore. Internal Affairs Officer Valerie Briggs had built her reputation on discipline, neutrality, and an unwavering belief in the system. For over a decade, she had investigated officer misconduct across multiple departments, exposing everything from small-scale bribery to procedural cover-ups. But nothing had prepared her for the chaos brewing in Westbridge. When the first wave of leaked files surfaced, documents, videos, and voice recordings implicating a hidden group within the Westbridge Police Department, it was Valerie who was brought in to lead the internal investigation. On paper, she was the ideal choicing, unaffiliated with the precinct, no prior ties to any involved officers, and a clean record. But behind the scenes, there was one detail unknown to the public. Valerie had once crossed paths with Commander Felix Dorn. Early in her career, she had been invited to a recruitment seminar hosted by Dorn himself. He was polished, persuasive, and disturbingly charming. He'd hinted at career shortcuts and internal alliances. Valerie declined, instinctively unsettled by the vague promises. A week later, a complaint was filed against her, claiming misconduct in an unrelated case. Though it was eventually dismissed, she had never forgotten it. Now, years later, Felix's name surfaced again, this time under accusations far worse than unethical leadership. Valerie knew what she was stepping into wasn't a normal investigation. It was a war zone where the enemies were the same bad she did. Still, she pressed forward, determined to pull apart the threads that held the bluing together. The first challenge was access. Requests for files were delayed or returned incomplete. Key pieces of evidence were labeled missing, or pending review. Officers refused to cooperate or claimed no memory of relevant events. Some went on sudden leave. One resigned abruptly and left town. Valerie knew obstruction when she saw it. She filed a motion to subpoena the department's digital archives and assigned a forensic analyst to retrieve deleted surveillance footage. Days later, that analyst's car was vandalized and their home broken into. It wasn't subtle. Pressure mounted from above. City officials urged her to conduct the investigation carefully, warning her not to cause public panic. But Valerie understood the language. It was a soft threat to let things die quietly. Instead, she widened the scope. She requested financial records, body cam metadata, and private security footage from nearby buildings. Gradually, the pattern emerged. Certain officers were tied to repeated evidence disappearances. Others showed suspicious jumps in bank deposits. One lieutenant had purchased 3 properties in cash within 18 months. All had connections to Felix Dorn. Valerie started linking names, building a map of connections. It wasn't just the Blue Gang. It was a network that included street-level dealers, corrupt judges, and even civilian city employees. As the evidence grew, Valerie prepared arrest warrants for 7 officers. Before they could be served, Felix vanished. His house was found ransacked. His personal effects burned in the fireplace. His car was located 2 days later near the state border, abandoned. Blood on the seat matched his DNA, but there was no body. The department issued a press release calling it a possible targeted attack. Valerie didn't believe it. She suspected it was staged. Clean getaway masked as a tragedy. Public trust plummeted. News outlets flooded the story. City Hall scrambled to manage the backlash, firing several department heads and promising full transparency. Valerie, meanwhile, pushed ahead with the arrests. 4 officers were taken into custody. 2 fled before warrants were delivered. 1 died in what police called a suicide, though the timing raised eyebrows. The remaining members of the Blue Gang went underground. Valerie continued building cases, layering evidence, and applying federal pressure. The FBI joined the investigation, treating the case as organized crime. Though progress was being made, the core of the group, its leadership and structure, remained elusive. Valerie knew one thing: dismantling the Blue Gang would not happen in weeks or even months. This wasn't just about raw cops. It was about a culture of silence, a shield of authority that had protected criminals for years. And if Felix Dorn was still alive, he was watching. The blue line had been pierced. But the danger hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone quiet. Months passed, but the scars left by the Blue Gang's exposure remained etched deep into the city of Westbridge. The department had been gutted, with dozens of officers either arrested, suspended, or forced into early retirement. Yet the core of the criminal web still seemed intact. The public wanted answers, the media wanted justice. And Valerie Briggs, now appointed as director of the newly formed Westbridge Integrity Commission, knew the real work was only beginning. Behind the scenes, she and a small team continued sifting through hundreds of files, piecing together names, dates, and money trails. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This had never just been about Westbridge. Similar patterns of evidence tampering, financial irregularities, and vanishing suspects were surfacing in other nearby districts. The Blue Gang wasn't an isolated infection. It was part of something larger. Valerie coordinated with state and federal agencies to begin tracing those links. It was a painstaking process, built on silent cooperation and guarded trust. Meanwhile, Officer Neil Huxley, now walking with a prosthetic leg, refused to fade into the background. He became an unlikely public figure, appearing in interviews and speaking at reform panels. His testimony had been vital in court, helping convict several high-ranking officers. But even as people praised his bravery, he remained uneasy. Neil knew well how many had gotten away. The silence from certain precincts, the fear in young officers' eyes, the sudden disappearances of others. It all pointed to one truth: the Blue Gang was not gone. It had simply scattered. The most haunting silence of all came from Felix Dorn. Despite the blood left in his car and the burned remnants in his home, there was no conclusive evidence he was dead. No body had been found. No digital trace. Valerie was convinced he had faked his death. Networks slipping away with help from lies still embedded deep within law enforcement. Rumors emerged of sightings in other cities. An unnamed consultant advising small departments on internal structuring. A man using forged credentials to access court archives. A figure seen speaking with organized crowd groups. All were unconfirmed, but all pointed to the same unsettling conclusion: Felix Dorn was still out there. Despite these lingering shadows, Westbridge tried to rebuild. The police department underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was brought in from outside the state. Transparency initiatives were launched. Every patrol car was equipped with upgraded, tamper-proof cameras. Civilian oversight boards were granted authority. And yet, Valerie knew structure alone couldn't fix what had happened. The damage wasn't just physical or procedural. It was psychological. Citizens no longer trusted the badge. Officers questioned one another in silence. And those who had once proudly worn the uniform now bore a hidden weight of suspicion. Joseph Finnick, the retired officer who had helped Neil expose the truth, lived quietly in the outskirts of the city. Though he had avoided the spotlight, he remained active behind the scenes, mentoring young officers and reviewing reform proposals. He often reminded Valerie and Neil of a hard truth: taking down the visible enemy was easy. Rooting out the invisible ones, The quiet loyalists, the hidden connections, the dormant networks, was a lifelong battle. Then came an encrypted email to Valerie's office. No sender, no trace. It contained a single photograph, a man resembling Felix Dorn, standing at a train station in another state, clean-shaven, wearing civilian clothes. The timestamp was recent. Attached was a line of text, "Still watching." The image was never released to the public. Valerie didn't want to spark panic or encourage conspiracy, but it was enough to confirm what she already feared. The Blue Gang hadn't been destroyed. It had been disrupted, dispersed, and like any criminal network that had tasted power, it was only a matter of time before it tried to return. Justice had been served, but incompletely. The system had been exposed, but not fully purged. And as Westbridge moved on, a lingering truth remained clear. Corruption doesn't always die. Some hides, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it puts on a new badge.